From the outside, Ethan Cole had everything a man could ever want. The kind of wealth that didn't just open doors, it erased them completely. Private jets waiting on standby, a mansion perched high above the coastline, and a reputation built on precision, control, and quiet dominance in rooms most people would never step into. He wasn't loud about his success, and maybe that's what made people trust him even more. Because men like Ethan didn't need attention, attention followed them. And standing beside him, often just out of focus in photographs, was Sarah Mitchell. To the public, she was the calm to his storm, the balance to his ambition, the woman who seemed to understand the man no one else truly could. Their story looked complete, almost rehearsed, like something carefully designed to be admired from a distance. But admiration has a way of blinding people to what's right in front of them, and in this case, it hid something that would soon become impossible to ignore. It started with a phone call. Short, unclear, enough to raise concern, but not enough to explain anything. By sunrise, Sarah Mitchell was gone. No confirmed sighting, no clear trail, no explanation that made sense. Her car was still parked. Her phone was left behind. And the house felt untouched, as if nothing had happened at all. Yet something had. The kind of something that doesn't leave obvious signs, but leaves a presence you can't quite shake. Investigators would later say that it wasn't what they found that unsettled them the most. It was what they didn't find. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. No panic. Just silence, thick and heavy, stretching across every room. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, calm, composed, answering questions with the same steady tone that built his empire. He said she left. He said she needed space. He said he didn't know where she went. And for a moment, people wanted to believe him. Because it's easier to believe in the version of someone we've already accepted than to question everything we thought we knew. But stories like this don't stay quiet for long. Small details began to surface, the kind most people would overlook, but the kind that slowly shift everything. A neighbor recalling a sound late into the night. A staff member mentioning a conversation that didn't feel right. A timeline that didn't quite hold together the more it was examined. And suddenly, the perfect image began to crack. The man who once seemed untouchable was now at the center of a growing storm, one that refused to settle. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened inside that house wasn't just a disappearance. It was the beginning of a story that would force people to question how well they really know anyone, especially those who appear to have everything under control. Was what happened that night a calculated decision, or was it a moment Ethan Cole could no longer control? That question would sit at the center of everything that followed, because nothing about Sarah Mitchell's disappearance felt simple, and nothing about Ethan's version of events felt complete. The man who once moved through life with certainty now found himself repeating fragments of a story that never seemed to land the same way twice. And as those small differences began to stack up, people started asking questions they never thought they would ask about him. Who was Sarah Mitchell in the final hours before she vanished? And what was she trying to say that never reached anyone? And more importantly, who was Ethan Cole when no one else was watching, when the cameras were gone, when the image he built no longer needed to perform? Because the deeper investigators looked, the more the timeline refused to settle into something clear. Hours went missing, details overlapped, and simple answers became harder to hold on to. Friends described Sarah as focused, careful, not the kind of person to disappear without a word, especially not leaving everything behind. Her phone, her car, her routine, all frozen in place as if she intended to return at any moment. But she didn't. And Ethan Cole, the one person who should have known exactly where she was, could only offer uncertainty wrapped in confidence. He said enough to sound believable, but never enough to bring clarity. And that space between what was said and what was missing began to grow louder than anything else. So the question shifted. Not just what happened that night, but what had been building long before it. Was this something planned in silence, carefully hidden beneath years of control and discipline? Or was it something that surfaced in a single moment that changed everything? And if it was that moment, what pushed it there? What was said? What was done? What crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed? Because whatever the answer was, it didn't just take Sarah Mitchell away. It pulled Ethan Cole into a reality where every word, every movement, and every second of that night would be examined. And as the investigation tightened around him, one thing became impossible to ignore. The truth wasn't just waiting to be found, it was being held back. Ethan Cole wasn't just rich, he was influential in a way that made people pay attention without him ever asking for it. His rise didn't come from luck, at least not the kind people could easily point to. It came from decisions, calculated ones, the kind that built a reputation strong enough to make others step aside when he entered a room. In business circles, his name carried weight. Deals closed faster when he was involved. Risks seemed smaller, outcomes more certain. People described him as focused, disciplined, always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. There was a calmness to him, something controlled, something that made it hard to imagine him ever losing grip of a situation. And over time, that image didn't just define his career, it defined how people saw him entirely. Untouchable wasn't a word he used, but it was one others used for him. And then there was Sarah Mitchell. She didn't arrive in Ethan Cole's world with the same power or recognition, but she brought something else entirely. She was sharp, observant, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, people paid attention. Those who knew her described her as grounded, someone who understood people in a way that went beyond surface impressions. When she and Ethan were seen together, it made sense in a way that was hard to explain. She balanced him, softened the edges people rarely noticed, gave a different dimension to the man everyone thought they already understood. To outsiders, their relationship looked steady, even reassuring, like two lives aligning at exactly the right moment. She believed in what they were building, believed she had found her place beside him, not behind him, not beneath him, but beside him. But relationships, especially ones that look perfect from the outside, often carry details no one else gets to see. Small moments that don't make it into photographs, quiet conversations that shift the tone in ways no one else can hear. Over time, those small moments can begin to change things. Subtle at first, almost invisible, but enough to leave an impression. There were hints, nothing obvious, nothing anyone could point to with certainty, but enough to suggest that not everything between Ethan Cole and Sarah Mitchell was as steady as it appeared. The kind of tension that doesn't announce itself, but lingers just beneath the surface, waiting for something to bring it forward. And whatever existed in that space between them, whatever had been building quietly behind closed doors, would eventually become impossible to keep hidden. It started like any other night in the home of Ethan Cole, the kind of night that followed a familiar pattern, quiet, controlled, predictable in the way routines often are when two people have settled into a rhythm that no longer needs explanation. Dinner was served, conversations were had, and for anyone looking in from the outside, nothing about those hours would have seemed out of place. There were no signs, no warnings, nothing that suggested this night would be any different from the ones that came before it. Sarah Mitchell was there, moving through the evening the same way she always did, present, composed, part of a life that, at least on the surface, still held together. And Ethan Cole, as always, remained steady, measured, the same man people believed never lost control of anything around him. But sometime after midnight, that rhythm broke. The exact moment is still unclear, lost somewhere between conflicting accounts and the silence that followed. But what is certain is that something shifted inside that house. What began as an ordinary night turned into something else entirely, something that would later be picked apart piece by piece, yet never fully understood. Neighbors would recall hearing a sound, not loud enough to alarm immediately, but unusual enough to stand out in hindsight. A sudden noise that didn't belong to the quiet of that neighborhood, followed by something even more unsettling, nothing at all. No movement, no voices, no indication that anything had happened after that moment passed. Just silence settling in, as if the house itself had closed in on whatever took place inside it. And by morning, Sarah Mitchell was gone. Not missing in a way that left behind confusion and scattered clues, but gone in a way that felt deliberate in its absence. Her phone remained where it shouldn't have been, her car untouched, her belongings exactly as she left them, as if she had stepped out for a moment and never returned. There were no calls for help, no messages sent, no attempt to reach anyone. It was as though she had been removed from the world she occupied without leaving behind a single clear trace. And Ethan Cole, the one person who had been there through it all, stood at the center of that silence with answers that never quite filled the space Sarah left behind. When authorities arrived at Ethan Cole's home, the stillness inside felt heavier than it should have. This wasn't the kind of scene investigators were trained to walk into, where evidence speaks clearly and events leave behind a trail that can be followed step by step. Instead, everything looked almost untouched, as if the night before had simply paused and never resumed. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had come in or out in a way that broke the normal order of things. No struggle, no overturned furniture, no obvious disruption. Just silence, sitting in every room, stretching across every surface, refusing to explain itself. And the more they looked, the less it made sense, because a disappearance without disturbance raises more questions than it answers. But even in a case filled with unknowns, one person could not be ignored. Ethan Cole was there when Sarah Mitchell was last seen, the last known person to share that space with her before she vanished without a trace. At first, his explanation seemed simple enough. He told investigators she left, that she needed space, that nothing unusual had happened between them that night. His tone remained steady, controlled, the same way it always had been, and for a brief moment, it almost held together. But as questions became more specific, as timelines were revisited and details revisited again, small inconsistencies began to surface. The kind that might seem insignificant on their own, but when placed side by side, start to shift the entire narrative. What he said in one moment didn't fully align with what he said in another, and the certainty he once carried began to show cracks. Then his story changed. Subtle at first, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying close attention, but enough to raise concern. What began as a clear account turned into uncertainty. He no longer seemed as sure about the sequence of events, about the timing, about what exactly had happened inside that house after midnight. At one point, he claimed she left. Later, he said he couldn't remember parts of the night clearly. And that shift, from confidence to hesitation, became impossible to ignore. Investigators have seen it before, the moment when a story begins to separate from the truth, when maintaining control becomes harder than expected. And as they dug deeper, as they started to examine not just what was said, but what was left unsaid, they came across something that didn't belong in a house where nothing was supposed to have happened. Something small, almost overlooked, but powerful enough to change the direction of the entire case. Something that suggested the silence inside Ethan Cole's home was hiding more than anyone initially believed. What investigators uncovered inside Ethan Cole's property wasn't obvious at first glance. It wasn't something placed where anyone could easily find it. And maybe that was the point. It was hidden in a way that suggested intention, not panic, something placed carefully, deliberately, as if time had been taken to make sure it stayed out of sight. And when it was finally brought into the light, it changed everything people thought they understood about that night. Because this wasn't just another missing detail to be explained away. It was something that directly connected Ethan Cole to the silence that surrounded Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. The kind of discovery that doesn't just raise questions, but answers them in a way that leaves very little room for doubt. For a man who built his life on control, on staying ahead, on managing every outcome, this was the one thing he couldn't account for anymore. Buried deep within the property, beyond the areas that reflected his carefully maintained image, was a truth he never expected anyone to reach. A truth that didn't match the story he had been telling from the beginning. It wasn't just evidence, it was a contradiction, a direct challenge to every explanation he had given, every version of events he had tried to hold together. And once it was found, everything else began to fall into place, the inconsistencies, the gaps, the moments that never quite made sense before. They started to align in a way that pointed in one direction, toward a reality Ethan Cole could no longer control or reshape. The image he had built, the one people trusted, the one that made his words believable, began to collapse under the weight of what was now undeniable. And just like that, the truth that had been held back, contained within the walls of that house, began to surface in a way no one could ignore. It moved beyond quiet suspicion and into something concrete, something that demanded to be acknowledged. For those following the case, it was the moment everything shifted, the point where uncertainty gave way to clarity, where the question was no longer what happened, but how long it had been hidden. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, No longer the man people once believed they understood, but the man now forced to face the consequences of a truth that refused to stay buried. Even after the verdict was delivered, after the courtroom settled and the headlines began to fade, the story of Ethan Cole and Sarah Mitchell refused to come to a clean end. There was a sense that something still lingered, something unresolved that no final decision could fully explain. People followed every detail, every statement, every moment presented during the trial. Yet even with everything laid out, the questions didn't disappear. They only became quieter, more personal, shifting into the kind of thoughts people carry with them long after the case is closed. Because what happened between Ethan Cole and Sarah Mitchell wasn't just about evidence or timelines. It was about understanding a moment that may never be fully understood. Some believed it had been carefully thought out, a sequence of decisions made long before that night ever arrived, hidden beneath years of control and precision. Others saw it differently, not as something planned, but as a moment where control finally gave way, where something broke in a way that couldn't be undone. And that uncertainty, that space between intention and impulse, is what kept the story alive in the minds of those who followed it. Because if someone like Ethan Cole, a man defined by discipline and structure, could reach that point, then it challenges something deeper, something more uncomfortable about how well anyone can truly know another person. And as the mansion that once symbolized success now stood quiet, holding on to everything that had taken place within it, one thought continued to surface again and again. Sometimes, the people we trust the most, the ones who seem the most in control, are the ones capable of the things we never see coming. What do you think really happened that night between Ethan Cole and Sarah Mitchell? Was it something planned from the beginning, carefully hidden beneath everything people believed about him? Or was it a moment that slipped beyond control and changed everything in an instant? And when you look back at everything that's been uncovered, every detail, every contradiction, every silence that filled that house, does it feel like the truth was always there waiting to be seen, or something that only revealed itself when it was already too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective on what really happened. And if you want more stories like this, real cases that challenge what we think we understand, make sure you subscribe so you never miss what's coming next.